With skyrocketing unemployment and those still employed very fearful of losing their jobs or struggling to survive or forced onto the front lines in this economy, Reverend Dr. William Barber II is calling for nonviolent moral resistance as a means to get protection for the most vulnerable among us in this pandemic. He expanded on that, saying, quote, "We need grace and testing and health care and living wages and rent forgiveness." Reverend Barber is the national co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign and president of Repairers of the Breach, and he joins me now via Skype. It's an honor to see you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be there.
One of the things that we've talked a lot about on this show is all of the existing inequities that have just been further exacerbated and revealed by this dynamic with the pandemic. What are you seeing out there?
Pandemics exploit and live within the fissures of our society. And we know that America, before this pandemic, had a lot of fissures because of poverty and racism. 140 million people poor and low income, 700 people dying a day, 250,000 a year from poverty and low income, according to a study by Columbia University. 80 million people either uninsured, or underinsured. Then COVID hits and everything skyrockets. The amount of unemployment. We're talking now, one study came out last week, said we might add another 11 to 12 million people to the uninsured because of their losing their jobs. We're going to add exponentially to the number of poor people that are low income people. We are seeing that essential workers have often been a new title. We used to call them service workers, but they're a new title. And many people feel like essential means expendable because they call them essential, give them a title, but they still don't have health care, many of them, paid sick leave, sufficient unemployment. They don't have the protections they need. And all of these are matters of choice. It did not have to be. Just like even before COVID, we made a choice to care more about Wall Street and Front Street than Back Street and side roads. We made a choice to engage in Reaganism from the top down, hoping it would come down rather than building from the bottom up.
Right.
And COVID only exacerbated that reality.
Talk to us about what you want to see. What are your list of demands? Because the original Poor People's Campaign obviously had a very specific list, including a federal jobs guarantee, including universal basic income. What are you looking for here?
Even before COVID, we were saying that health care ought to be connected to your body and your life and not your job. We're the only country of the 25 wealthiest countries in the world that does not provide health care that's attached to the person, their humanity, not their job. We've been fighting for living wages. We've been fighting for more affordable health care. We know that right now in this country, there's not a county in this country where you can work a minimum wage job. Many of those are those so-called essential jobs that you can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment on a minimum wage salary. We have been saying we need to build from the bottom up, so we put together an entire agenda. And in this moment of pandemic, it's to us, it's criminal that, number one, the first 3 bills gave more than $2.5 trillion to the corporations at the top and did not reach the people at the bottom. Millions, 140 million people were basically ignored. Essential workers were basically ignored. In the midst of a pandemic, a health pandemic, we're not providing health care for everyone. That's criminal. It's ridiculous. In the midst of a pandemic, we're not guaranteeing that people's water can't be cut off and their utilities can't be cut off and they can't be evicted. In the midst of a pandemic, we are not taking care of the homeless as we should or undocumented workers. We are saying all of those are our demands. And the pandemic is saying to us, you either do this and close these fissures in society, or this pandemic, this germ will continue to exploit them. And it will not stay among the poor and the undocumented and the First Nation people and the tribes. It will hurt and destroy their lives, but it will also spread throughout the rest of the society.
That's right. What do you make of the fact, you're being very critical, as I have been, as we have been on this show, of the government response, which has overwhelmingly been to the benefit of the most affluent, the well-connected, the largest corporations. That first relief bill had $4 trillion that went to big business. Meanwhile, small businesses got scraps, workers got very little. Unemployment continues to skyrocket. And still, as you point out, no provision for health care in the midst of a pandemic as people lose their health insurance. What do you make of the fact that that bill was supported unanimously by all the Democrats and Republicans in the Senate who voted on it.
It is a tragedy. It is wrong. It is immoral. I don't care whether the Democrat or the Republicans, anybody that supported and endorsed that bill. Now, you said workers and you said the corporate leaders, 83% of all the money went to corporations. Not a damn thing went to the poor and low-income people, the people who may not run this country politically, but they make this country run. You know, we as I said, we call people essential. We changed their title from from service workers to essential workers. But what many of them are telling me is they say they feel like what that really means, they're expendable workers. And these are choices. It did not have to be before COVID. It did not have to be after COVID. But what we're finding is too many people are too comfortable with other people's deaths. And we've said to Democrats, you should have passed the bill in the House that ought to be. If McConnell wanted to cut it, if he wanted to undermine the thousands and thousands of people in Kentucky that are poor and low wealth and need health care, over 200,000 of them, then put him on blast. But we failed in our response. The president failed, the Congress failed. Too many of our people are still trapped in this neoliberalism, from the top down. It's warped our imagination and our moral imagination, and we need to go back. And we're fighting in this next bill. We're still concerned. There's some good things in it, but there's still no wage guarantee. There's still no full coverage of health care for everybody that needs it. And we're making mistakes that the pandemic will exploit. That's what our experts tell us, that a pandemic is not just a biological event, it's a sociological event as well. And by leaving these fissures open, we are leaving the society open to death and destruction that's going to last a long time. And now the Fed came out last night, I think, and said we need something like $10 trillion. I was asked, somebody said to us the other day, you don't expect to change the whole healthcare system in the middle of a pandemic. And I said, we changed slavery in the midst of slavery. We changed Jim Crow in the midst of Jim Crow. We changed our Social Security and labor rights and minimum wage in the midst of the Great Depression. That's when you change.
Right.
That's when you're supposed to change.
Right. Well, and not to mention, millions of people are losing their health insurance as we speak. So things have changed very quickly for them. They just don't want to change it for those who are benefiting from this current system. I mean, look, we've seen who's had the ear of the White House, of the Senate, of the House. We see who has benefited most from these bills. How do we change that dynamic, especially in the midst of a pandemic when it's still really unsafe for people to physically congregate and demonstrate the power of the people that you might do in a different time?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, let me acknowledge what you just said. We're talking about 13 million, possibly more people losing their insurance, according to a study by Harvard. We're saying that 40% of people who make under $40,000 will lose their job. I mean, we have to face this. Now, what do? We take social media and what we have. Back in the day, Ella Baker organized the NAACP in the South in a telephone booth. So we take this social media. So we've called for stay in place, stay alive, organize, and don't believe the lies. We're saying don't believe these lies about it's safe and you can go out and those things. Stay in place, live, and organize. How do we organize? This coming Wednesday and Thursday, we're asking 100,000 people to join us in calling into McConnell and Pelosi and demand a true rescue bill. Then we're asking people to organize for June 20th, 2020. When we're organized, we're sending out invites to 50 million people through social media. And we're saying, join us on that day for a mass full people's assembly and a moral march on Washington digital gathering. And on that day, the people you will hear will be white people from the Appalachia, the black people from Alabama, to Latino people from California, lifting up their conditions both before COVID, during COVID, but also saying, here are the demands. And then they're going to be building power. They're registering people to vote. They're organizing around an agenda, because we have found out that if 5 to 15% of poor and low income people will register to vote, according to a study we're going to release later, they could fundamentally shift the politics in this country, all over the country, especially in the South. And we're saying to candidates, you don't have to ask our campaign to endorse you. You need to endorse the issues that will cause people to live. You need to say to people, if I'm elected, This is how people will have health care. If I'm elected, this is how people will have basic income. If I'm elected, this is how people will have living wages. And this is not a matter, we're so sick of these titles, left and right, and socialism versus democracy. That's just foolish stuff. The issue is, how will your campaign establish justice? How will you provide for the common defense? How will you promote the general welfare for everybody? And how will you guarantee equal protection under the law? That's what we're concerned about. Our deepest moral values and our deepest constitutional values. And we intend to build power and change the narrative of this country and force America to see the poor and the low income, the people that we aren't seeing as people are focusing on the most wealthy and the already prosperous.
What are your hopes and what are your expectations for Vice President Biden's willingness to embrace and ultimately fight for, if he ascends to the presidency, your agenda?
Well, I'll tell you what I said to him on Easter Sunday. I did a podcast with him on Easter, and I said to him very clearly that there are things that he and others were talking about prior to COVID. They were talking about what was practical, and there was this conversation versus, one candidate, Biden versus Warren versus Bernie. I said, we're past all of that now. The issue now is COVID has exposed, these fissures have exposed these problems deeply. They were already there, and too many people were too comfortable with them before. Now we ignore them even the more to our own detriment. And this is, like I said on Easter, it's like from crucifixion to resurrection. It's like, the question is, do you recognize, I said to him, that this is in fact just like a Great Depression moment? And the question is, what are you going to do? Because the things that you may have said were not practical before are necessary now. Before, we heard you couldn't find the money. Well, we know that's a lie now, because in less than 3 weeks, we found over $2.5 trillion, and you mentioned $3 trillion. So we can't tell folk there's no money there now for healthcare. There's no money there for living wage. What we have now is clearly a matter of choice. And I said to him, well, you've got to decide whether you will choose not to be Democrat, not to be Republican, not to be left, not to be right, but to be a statesman, a moral statesman in this moment, recognize this time and call for fundamental change. We have to have the health care for all. We can't keep playing around and just saying we have an Affordable Care Act. 14 states didn't even pass the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
We can't any longer just talk about, not talk about living wage. Every congressperson, you think about it, every congressperson in Washington, D.C., they get paid in excess of $150,000, $160,000. They get guaranteed 80% of their pension, which is $139,000. They get guaranteed health care, pre-existing condition. How in the world can you be a congressperson and you get all of these guarantees and then you do not want the people who elected you to have at least the same things that you have? That is immoral. That is trifling, as my grandmother used to say. And we are going to have to step up, and he's going to have to step up, and all of them have to step up. And if they do, I said, if you start talking about poor and low income people, we can expand the electorate, but we can't have another election season in the general election like we had in 2016. All those debates and not one on poverty and low wealth, even though 43% of the people are poor and low wealth in this country. We cannot have a conversation that talks about partial health care when now we may have as many as 93,000 million people uninsured or underinsured. Those conversations no longer work. We're in a different place, and we must have a different position.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And last question for you, Reverend Barber. Your campaign, your Poor People's Campaign, it's a multiracial campaign, as it was during Dr. King's time. It was controversial in Dr. King's time, and frankly, it's controversial right now. What is your hope for solidarity across races among poor people?
Seeing the people that are coming together. Our campaign has traveled to more than 40 states across this country. We now have 45 coordinating committees in 45 states in the District of Columbia. And those coordinating committees are made up of poor and impacted people. They're advocates, moral leaders of every race, creed, color, and sexuality. I have seen what can happen. We have seen people coming together, thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Every one of our state coordinating committees are connecting 30,000 people to their work. That's over 200,000 people that will be able to connect. We have 16 denominations connected, and the religious bodies of all races and creeds and colors connected to this work. We have over 100 partners. People are coming together. We were coming together before COVID and saying, somebody's hurting our brothers and sisters and it's gone on far too long. We won't be silent anymore. But after COVID, people are coming together. In fact, we thought about canceling, because we couldn't meet physically. And we had people come to us and say, no, we have to gather. In fact, one lady told me this story. She said, every day I feel like I'm being forced to mass murder. She said, I may not be living by June 20th because I'm an essential worker that's having to go in without the mask. She's in a nursing home situation. We have to get garbage bags to try to cover ourselves. And it seems like nobody cares. She said, this is like mass murder. She said, but I want people to still gather. I may not be there. And so some of us made the commitment to say this. In 48 hours, any of us could be taking our last breath with COVID. That's the truth. And so the question is, if you knew your last breath was coming 48 hours from now, what would you use your last 2 days of breath to fight for? What kind of world, what kind of society, what kind of health care, what kind of living wages? What would you do with 48 hours of breath? We have taken that pledge that we may live another 40 years, but for now, we're going to live as though we only have 48 hours left, and we're determined to use our breath to breathe new justice and morality in this society. And millions of people, thousands of people around this country are saying it's time.
Reverend Barber, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for fighting this fight that you have been devoting your life to. We really appreciate it.
God bless you, and thank you for what you do.
My pleasure. We'll have more Rising for you after this.